The Museum of Religious Freedom was imagined as an inclusive virtual space for archiving, learning, and critically reflecting on the complex histories and contemporary concerns relating to the freedom of religion or belief in Sri Lanka.
Thematic areas within the museum have been informed by the mapping of 70 events and incidents related to religious freedom and is a place for exploratory learning spanning from the colonial period to the present day.
We invite you to discover the virtual spaces made up of digitized artifacts and architectural elements, archival documents, audio-visual content, community conversations, and expert commentary, focused on issues related to the freedom of religion or belief in Sri Lanka. Join us.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Shalomi, and welcome to the third of a series of webinars organized by Minor Matters on the Museum of Religious Freedom, which we are currently developing. The trailer you just saw very briefly introduced you to the museum, which is, of course, the basis of all our conversations. In case you are new to Minor Matters is a national campaign to advance the freedom of religion or belief and promote religious harmony in Sri Lanka. We particularly work with youth, but also other stakeholders to increase literacy on and promote social respect for religious freedom in the country. Before we go any further, we want to take a moment to thank you all for taking the time to join us on a Sunday evening to be a part of this conversation. Our aim is to make this an engaging and meaningful hour. Let me just briefly comment on what the Museum of Religious Freedom is all about. Most of us here may agree that religious freedom has been a contentious topic in Sri Lanka. While the history concerning religious freedom has been fraught with complexity, the present too, as we all know, has had its fair share of concerns. So the Museum of Religious Freedom has been envisioned and developed as an inclusive and trilingual space to archive, learn, and critically reflect on the complex histories and contemporary concerns relating to religious freedom in Sri Lanka. Also, the space is digitally immersive, and we have used technology to amplify and bring
அதற்காக நாம் தொழில்நுட்பத்தை பயன்படுத்தியிருக்கின்றோம். வரலாற்றிலிருந்து பலவிதமான
was a recipient of the Intercultural Innovation Award by the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations and the BMW Group in 2019. For those joining today, let me also very quickly give you an idea of our conversations over the past couple of weeks. Last Sunday, we explored the relationship between religion and the colonial state and the factors underlying religious identity formation in British colonial Ceylon, which was actually the focus of the first cluster of the museum. The previous week, we spoke about what went into building the Museum of Religious Freedom, and we particularly spoke about the thinking behind the museum, its objectives, the research and curatorial thought that has shaped the museum, and of course, the design and development. So today we will be discussing Sri Lanka's relationship to its history of conflict and the impact that has had on religious freedom, as well as the continued hindrances to religious gathering, expression, and remembrance in Sri Lanka. Let me now introduce you to our moderator and panelists. Our moderator today is Dr. Vindya Buddhitiya. She is an anthropologist and curator working at the intersection of conflict and visual culture. She's an associate lecturer in social anthropology at the University of St. Andrews and a member of Photodemos, the Camera and the Political Imagination at UCL Anthropology. She also has over a decade of research and policy experience in the international development sector, spanning post-war reconciliation and community environment relationships in Sri Lanka. Our panelists for today, firstly, we have Ambika Sakuranadan. She's a human rights lawyer based in Sri Lanka, who is currently an Open Society Fellow. From October 2015 to March 2020, she was a commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, where she led the first ever national study of prisons. Her research and advocacy and activism have focused on transitional justice, custodial violence, penal policy, militarization, gender, and Tamil nationalism. Her report on drug control, detention, and rehabilitation in Sri Lanka, the first such study, was published in August 2021 by Harm Reduction International. Next, we have Shreen Abdul Sarur, who is a co-founder of Mana Women's Development Federation and Women's Action Network, a collective of 11 women's groups that have been working on advocacy on women's rights and documentation with a focus in the north and east of Sri Lanka. She was a recipient of the Voices of Courage Award by the International Rescue Committee's Women and Refugees Commission in 2008, the 5th International Bremen Peace Award under the category of Public Engagement for Peace and Justice, and the N-Peace Award in 2011, and the prestigious Ashoka Fellowship and the Franco-German Human Rights and Rule of Law Prize in 2017. Next, we have Ruki Fernando, who has been involved in human rights and social justice issues for over 2 decades. He's written extensively and conducted several training on memorialization in Sri Lanka in particular. And last but not least, we have Suchita Bevikrama, who is a program officer on ethics education at Arigato International and a trainer on interreligious dialogue, peace building, and conflict transformation, working internationally with experiences of facilitating training in over 30 countries. He has also given leadership to different social movements and groups such as Rally for Unity, Rise Up Sri Lanka, and Interfaith Colombo. He also leads programs on Buddhist approaches to conflict transformation. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and I will hand over to our moderator for today. Vindhya, over to you.
Hi, Shalomi, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for this conversation. We appreciate it because it is a Sunday. I hope it will be a frank examination of how we engage with Sri Lanka's history and present of conflict as it relates to religious harm and unfreedom. How do we collectively remember atrocity? How do we memorialize violence? How do we pass on knowledge of complex and still contested recent histories and community relationships within spaces of learning and education, especially when they are confronted with active erasure, denial, misrepresentation, and amongst whom and how do we encourage conversations about these events, especially thinking about how they continue to form or rather inform interreligious and interethnic tensions. At the Museum of Religious Freedom, we have over many months had many sometimes difficult conversations about how to provide this information and what that knowledge should look like, how we write, how we show, how we illustrate, and ultimately how we encourage our visitors to engage with and reflect on these events and questions. How do we also responsibly include, engage, and incorporate the narratives and testimony of communities and practitioners in a wider environment of unsafety? What are the ethical considerations we must think through in their addition and representation within the museum space? We briefly discussed the politics of museumification in our first webinar, so I won't delve into it again. But if you did miss the session, I believe it is now online and the links will be shared with you on the chat. Ethnic conflict and religious harm is one of the main clusters of our virtual museum. Churches, temples, mosques, and kovills have served as sanctuaries for support, spiritual respite, refuge, and safety for communities across the island during times of crisis and hardship. However, the island's ethno-nationalist and ideological conflicts were extremely damaging to these spaces of religious worship. This is the thought that has underpinned the design of this component to provide visitors a space for reflection and allowing them to listen to impacted communities share their experiences in their own words. Sites of religious worship, as well as religious leaders and clergy in the north and east of Sri Lanka in particular, were also disproportionately affected by and targeted in acts of wartime violence perpetrated by state and non-state actors with no accountability. We also note how places of religious significance were widely subjected to acts of retaliation in the hands of warring parties, gravely affecting communities that were victimized by conflict. So the ethnic conflict and religious harm component of the museum is intended as a space for solemn reflection and memorialization with respect to the communities directly impacted by many decades of state and anti-state violence. I would also like to draw attention to the escalating tensions and violence between and within the island's ethno-religious communities and detrimental state-led interventions that have defined this post-war period, which I believe some of our panelists will speak to in greater detail. The cluster is presently centered on several examples of religious harm which took place during the Civil War years. These include the Arantalava massacre, the Katankudi and Erabur mosque attacks, the Navali church bombing, and the shelling of the shrine of Our Lady of Madhu, and constitutes an ongoing effort to expand shared learning and remembrance. We also note the significance of incidents, including the Anuradhapura massacre, the expulsion of Muslims from the northern province, the bombing of the Temple of the Tooth in Kandy, the Pesalai church attack, and as well as 1,560 Hindu temples that were damaged during the war, with 240 sites being completely destroyed. We also honor the memory of Father Tiruchelvam Nihal Jim Brown and Father Francis Joseph, notable Catholic community leaders committed to humanitarian service who were disappeared in 2006 and 2009, respectively. Through this museum space, we pay our respects to the lives lost in and affected by these atrocities, as well as the reprisal violence that followed. Where possible, we have actively involved and included testimony from religious leaders and members of the affected communities, as well as incorporating elements from community documentation and memorial practices. So bearing this in mind, we're hoping this webinar will serve as an opportunity to reflect on Sri Lanka's relationship to its history of conflict and impact on religious freedom, as well as inter-community tensions and solidarities. I hope this serves as a beginning of a conversation to inform our ongoing work with the museum rather than a series of conclusions. So on that note, I will wrap up and invite our panelists to start with a set of initial reflections of about 5 minutes each. And then after that, we will follow this up with a discussion and open up to audience questions. So over to you, Ambika, to start things off.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Vindhya. Very happy to be part of this. So I will make, general observations, and maybe then we can speak about particular issues in detail. I think I would like to also take a broader approach, because when you speak about conflict and religion, it's also ethno-religion, and there are points at which it intersects with the ethnic conflict. If we look at memorialization, I think particularly increasingly now, we need to look at it within the broad framework of banning the memorializing of anything to do with the war and the victims of it. So whether it's memorializing massacres or shelling of churches, anything related to the conflict we find is banned. So then the violence experienced by the victims is not acknowledged. Because the end of the war itself is termed a victory and it is celebrated. So even those families of soldiers who were killed or missing are likewise not allowed to grieve, but expected to celebrate. So state violence or mass violence is accepted and whitewashed. When the state itself engages in whitewashing or denying violence, it also becomes increasingly difficult to examine incidents of violence that are inter-community or even intra-community, like intra-community violence within the Tamil community, or the expulsion of Muslims by the LTT from the northern province. So here, once again, the state is deciding whose life can be grieved and whose cannot. Many incidents of violence are also unknown because they're documented, but in books or reports that are gathering dust, and hence particularly younger people these days do not know about it and also may not be able to access it. But also, if we go look at oral history, which is one of the ways in which you memorialize or document violence, we find within communities, this might not happen because it's related to trauma and pain. I find this a lot in the North. or even in relation to the 1983 riots. But in the diaspora, for instance, in the struggle to keep history and memory alive, the sharing may be done, but while it is done, it is also passing the trauma and pain to the successive generations. Memorializing violence happens when stories of violence and its impact are shared with younger generations. But I feel like there hasn't been enough studies done on this. Like, does it live on in the memories of children and grandchildren? If it lives on, which aspects live on? The political, the personal, or both? And memorializing takes place when a person or a community is publicly identified as a victim. This categorization is also a process that involves not merely whether one has been physically, psychologically, or economically harmed, but custom, social norms, politics, law, culture are all factors that determine who is categorized as a victim, hence what is remembered and what is forgotten. The perpetrator's violence might also be one of the few tools at the disposal of the victim to exert pressure on the state to claim their rights. So then what happens through this process of advocacy is another process of memorializing violence. But then it can also be shaped by the advocacy and certain elements discarded and certain elements highlighted according to expediency. So the Tamil community's use of the Nawali church massacre or mass violence at Mullawaikal is used as a main advocacy platform to lobby for international intervention in their quest for justice. Sorry, was there? Am I over time? No.
No, I think you're fine,
Okay.
please. Sorry about that. Not sure what it is.
Yes, armed conflict and even violence we see in Sri Lanka, it has become normalized, and the ethnic conflict has a lot to do with it. And it has led to violence seeping into every pore of our institutional structures, systems, and processes. That is also why the structures and systems still respond very positively to state attempts to prevent memorialization of violence and loss, such as court orders to ban processions of the affected families, which we've seen happen repeatedly. The structures, thereby, through this denial process, they enable the creation of a hegemonic memory. This memory then shapes the common identity, the creation of which becomes important in a context where forgetting the past is seen as imperative to move forward. So communities such as the Tamils and the Muslims who have experienced collective violence or intractable armed conflict and feel that their grievances have still not been addressed will not be able to perceive themselves as part of the so-called common shared identity. So here we see the link between the identity, memory, memorializing violence, acknowledging violence, and getting redress for that. Structural violence, I feel, does not receive the attention required in Sri Lanka. We look at more obvious forms of violence, but it's these structures that enable the perpetuation. So for instance, if we take at the more recent several incidents of violence against the Muslims, the Alutkama, Digana, then 14th of May 2019, it is many of these structures that are supposed to maintain law and order and also supposed to dispense justice that have not functioned in the way they ought to have, thereby in a way contributing to denying, burying, and whitewashing these violations that the Muslim community has experienced. Documentation is also memorializing violence. Once again, the state does not allow that, or it has made it risky. This has also happened for decades. It is also nothing new. For instance, in 2018, a civil society organization published a book called Recordings of Hidden People, which found that of the 414 persons they interviewed, they found that 120 persons had still not reported that their family member was missing to any state institution. So I think we do need to, when we speak about harm caused and seeking redress for those harms, it is important to look at structural violence, because that is invisible, that continues, and that enables the state to deny the violence took place and to also deny memorialization. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambika, for that. And I think that really summarized it really well in terms of situating it in relation to wider processes of structural violence and how sort of, the persecution of, religious communities is situated within a kind of spectrum of issues that we need to collectively delve into. And I look forward to talking about this more. So on that note, I think we're going to move on to Suchit. Suchit.
Hello, thank you, Vindhya, and thank you everyone for joining in for this important conversation. I join in as somebody from the education background, somebody who's from the peace building sector, and my reflections come from this orientation. And at the same time, I need to acknowledge the fact that I belong to the majority ethnic group, the majority religious groups, and my framing, my orientation to these conversations come from that point of view as well. I'm looking at violence, and the topic we are looking at, the memorialization of violence. Violence, when I think of violence, for me, what comes to my mind is people, right? Violence impacts people. It's transforms the lives of people because they lose loved one, they feel violated, and this impact on people is for me important and to consider. And to acknowledge that each and every act of violence has, there are those who are impacted by that violence. And there's a story, a harm that has taken place and a pain that exists there. And I think that's important to acknowledge. And the political discourses surrounding the acknowledgement often denies this individual experience of people. And I think that it's important to look at that experience and empathize with it and see where we orient ourselves in the responses. In terms of looking at memorialization, I wanted to reflect from the Buddhist practices of when there is a death in the family, one of the first things we do is we memorialize in a way. We hold the Mataka Vastra Pujava, we hold the Mataka Bana, we hold the Mataka Dana. 7 days on, we already memorialize the loss of the loved ones. We continue to do this as a practice in our traditions, maybe in the 3rd month of the loss, then 1 year later. So this aspect of memorialization is cultural. It is a part of the spiritual practice for communities as well. And it is should not be seen as something imposed, something from outside. It's something in our culture. And I think that's something I wanted to highlight. Then when we come to the history and the memorialization process now, as we are focusing on the post-colonial period, I think there is different experiences of violence at a communal level that took place. You have the Southern unrest, the 71 unrest, and then the 89 unrest, and then you have the 83 onwards, the armed conflict. So all of this has impacted communities in different ways, and there's different narratives that come up. Communities narrate this in different ways besides the political narrative. Often communities themselves narrate these events in different ways. I reflect that there are in these narratives that are majoritarian. The narrative of victory is a majoritarian narrative that is brought to the people and publicized, and use of media to popularize this narrative. At the same time, then besides the majoritarian narrative, there is also minoritarian narratives that speak about the issues of the minorities and highlights the grievance of the minority, but maybe in the process ignores also that there was harm in the majority, that there are people who were going through violence and experience of violence within the majority. So how do we take on these different narratives, the majoritarian narrative, the minoritarian narrative, and create a space for an inclusive narrative that recognizes the harm on people, harm and the violence that has impacted people. in terms of looking at history, and we were asked to also consider the approach to how do we keep these conversations going. I think for me, it's not about replacing an existing narrative with another narrative. As an education, it is not for me to just to recreate a narrative that is trying to replace the existing narrative. For me, it's what I see as a multiple narrative approach. We need to open up a society to let people explore these multiple narratives, that the majoritarian narrative is this is the minoritarian narrative, these are rather maybe. And then there's how do we build that inclusive narrative and have contested narratives out there and talked about and explored, and people to have the opportunity to listen to each other. Of course, the challenge in that is that we will antagonize people because these are contested narratives. The process can antagonize people and people will not come into these spaces. And I think that's what is important as we create these spaces. How do we make sure that we bring as many people as possible without just limiting it to a selective, a smaller group that is comfortable with maybe the topic. So, but how do we bring it in a sensitive way to a larger number of people, but at the same time not dilute the topic as well? There is issues of justice, there's issues of violence that needs not be diluted in bringing it to the masses, into the society and to the people. So that's of course a challenge, and a challenge I think Minority Matters is looking into and balancing out and engaging in. So, the last reflection maybe from my side is how do we memorialize? What do we memorialize? So personally for me, the Arantalava memorial, the memorial, I don't agree, I don't resonate, let's say, because it depicts a scene of gross violence, but it does not allow me to move on or transform. So I guess there are different approaches to memorialization as well. For me, what is important is memorialization approaches that help us to live and transform our relationship without ignoring what has happened, but still find ways to make us our future better future, and find ways that address these grievances. The structural violence needs to be transformed through the process of memorialization. So these are some initial reflections. I'm sure there's going to be much more value coming from the other speakers, and look forward to reflecting together. Thank you, Vindhya.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chetan. I think you draw out an important point about empathy and perhaps how we can cultivate empathy as well. And that's something I'd really like to bring up in the discussion, bearing the kind of pedagogical, bearing the educational in mind. And on that note, we're going to move on to Shreen.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Vindhya and the Minor Matter team. Thank you for the other speakers. They have made it easy. I just want to emphasize on 3 points here. One is with regard to memorialization. Memorialization in the context of how do we capture violence? Oftentimes when I visit Katangudi Mosque, the bullet marks on the mosque make me to question this. Even Zion Church that is being preserved as it is after the Easter bombing. If a set of people or children are taken on a historical tour to see Zion Church bombed, ridden the walls and areas that are being made so I have a question with regard to memorializing violence. Now, I'll throw another angle of it now with regard to Northern Muslims expulsion. I still grapple with it, whether it's based on my religion as a Muslim or based on the Tamil community, as Tamil community claim that we are Tamil-speaking minority, whether it's ethnicity or religion. So for many people, wanted to brand it as religion. Many of us, like people like me, we are Tamil-speaking Northerners. Now, why did this happen to us? Now, with regard to memorialization, as a person who has personally undergone expulsion, I want to capture the coexistence prior to the eviction. Yes, suffering of the Muslims need to be acknowledged, but to preserve something for the future generation, I want older generation of people to say, how did we coexist in Mana, my hometown, as Catholics, Hindus, and Muslims, and there were Sinhalese as well. How did we coexist? Is there a way that we could capture that? We have to capture violence. We have to hold everybody accountable, who is violating. That how do we do this? Again, empathy. And with regard to perpetrators, it is very easy for us to point finger at state when the state violates. But when the perpetrator is non-state, it is very, very difficult for us to hold them accountable for what they have done. I mean, very good example is Katankudi, or if you take Aljipotana, where the entire village was just wiped out. Or the Sinhala border villages and all, what do we do about it? I mean, how do we hold the perpetrator accountable? Then the other topic is about intra-religious conflict. So it's not always Catholic versus Hindus, Hindus versus Muslims, Buddhists versus Muslims. No. Within our own religious community, we have problem. What do we do? How do I hold my community accountable when Ahmadiyya community is being ostracized or attacked? I mean, that happened in the post-Easter context. Nobody took any notice of that particular community, right? And coming from Mana, again, there is a lot of conflict or violent attack between Catholics and Hindus, Hindus and Muslims, Muslims and Catholics. This is not, I won't say it is primarily war driven. It is something to do with our religious belief and how we have been trying to show that we are prominent, or we are powerful, or we need to take over a part of the piece of the land or whatever, right? So that's very important. And also within the Muslim community, like there is a growth of fundamentalism, radicalization, and there are new groups. We are becoming very intolerant towards very secular groups like Tariqa groups, Sufi groups and all. More recently, they have been violent. The way that how we worship, how we celebrate Prophet Muhammad's birthday, for example. So now what do we do about this? But at the same time, now in the post-war context, we are all grappling with Islamophobia, right? That is very much, globally driven. And then we see in Sri Lanka very systematically Muslim community being targeted. And then we also see a state that is very overtly saying it's not only a single only, but now it's a Buddhist state. And we have Buddhist monks, we have been seeing Buddhist monks sitting in the parliament, then where the state and the religion coming together. So that's the government that now we have to grapple with. So in that context, more recently, I mean, within a month, Muslim community has to face this, I think, month of March. They wanted to scrutinize Arabic books, anything that is imported. They seized the Quranic translation. They brought in a de-radicalization gazette, which is particularly scrutinizing the faith of the Muslim community. Then they have been continuously arresting Muslims and Tamils also for under PTA and ICCPR. More recently, day before yesterday, I heard a boy has been arrested in Gampala for the very reason he counted Nyanasara's statement of Allah being the major culprit of all this radicalization, because he reacted to it and he has been arrested. And then we also saw burqa ban, like the talk about in madrasa reform and all. So it's very difficult for communities like Muslim community to even rethink about anything that we really want to reform or what we need to do in that context. You all know that there is Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act reform process, which has been fought by Muslim women for the last 40 years or so, but now it is being framed as anti-Muslim. Then also I want to talk about a little bit about what does it mean to women with regard to all this religious violence. But every religion is used against women. Women can't even hold on to any leadership in our religious community. Therefore, any interreligious dialogue or anything to do with the religious violence, women are only seen as victims. Now, where are we? I mean, you take one example about this Vendapati, right? The Muslim community is, trying to put whatever this pill into all this food and serving and all. But it does to women is very interesting because it's all about controlling birth, right? So then the singular extreme religious leaders come and say, you women reproduce in numbers. The state will assist you. If you reproduce more than 4 or 5, state will give you allowance. Then on the other hand, they say Muslim women have to be somehow they have to be controlled with regard to the reproduction. Therefore, in places, not now, some years ago, I heard that there have been forceful cesarean for the Muslim women, so that less, like the more that they are cut every time, there is less number of birth. And then with regard to various notion of how women's body being controlled by various forms of violence, but it's religion is the reason. Now, what do we do with regard to even reforming some of the law in this country? It's highly problematic because in the religious community will not allow us. So when we talk about religious violence, what we are looking at is physical violence, structures, church being attacked, mosque being attacked, Quran being burned, and then people being killed, all these things, but structural violence, right? Now, a young girl in this country, 13, 14, she gets married. She became teenage mother at the age of 15 and 16. Then she becomes a single mother at the age of 20. Is that okay? Is that okay? And it's done in the name of a religion, and it's a law in this country. So those structural violence also need to be looked at this country if we want to move forward as a secular country, if we want to respect each other's religion and to move forward. And memorialization should capture that kind of a structural violence as well. I'll leave it with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shreen, for a host of issues that I'm hoping that we can address in greater detail. But I think you draw, again, attention to a really important point about the conflation of ethnic and religious identities and what that means in a post-war context where violence in various ways continues. So to wrap up, over to our final panelist, Ruki, before we can get to the Q&A. And in the meantime, I also encourage you to put any questions that you might have in the Q&A or the chat. Over to you, Ruki.
Thank you, Vindhya, and thank you to Minor Matters for inviting me. I will speak without the video, hoping that it will make sure my connection stays stronger. So I think that the memorialization is a very broad concept, but today I think the notice said that we are going to focus more on rights and safety of religious communities. So I think I will speak more from that perspective. And probably me coming from a Christian background, I will probably draw more references to examples from Christian related memorialization. So the first point that I would like to make is that wartime atrocities are difficult to put down purely on a religious basis. There are various other complexities, and I see 3, and there could be more. One is intertwined very much with ethnicity during the war. Then the second is, I think it's also intertwined with the idea of humanitarian space and community centers. Now, I think in international law, but more than that, in our own tradition and practice, people have always thought that religious places of religious worship would be safer than other places. So in various times of difficulties, there is a tradition of running to a nearby place of religious worship to seek safety. And this has been challenged, I think, in the course of the war. And good examples that I can cite are the Pesale Church, the Madhu Church, Alaipidi Church, Nawali Church. So these are all attacked in the context of people seeking refuge there, being humanitarian spaces. The third complexity is also, particularly from when I think of memorialization in terms of Christian religious leaders, it's also linked very much to human rights activism and activists. People like Father Mary Bastian, Father Chandra Fernando, Father Jim Brown, Father Michael Rodrigo killed in Buttala in the Monragala district, Father Srilala Maratunga killed, I think, in the Kampaha district or the borders with Kurunagal district, were all activists or human rights defenders in their own rights. And I think it was more their activism rather than their religious identity that led to them being either subjected to enforced disappearance or assassinated. So I think we have to bear this complexity in mind. We can't entirely compartmentalize only religious memorialization in the context of the war. The second thing is that I think something that is common to overall broader idea of memorialization also is significant in places of religious worship and religious personnel. We do have a culture of memorials, which is political as well as emotional and personal, and religious places have the same thing. So that is why we have some religious places, like whether it's the Katankodi Mosque or Arantala monks that were massacred, or in Christian places, that there are some memorials that happen in the physical structures as well as events. But there's also lack of interest. For example, in the Pesale church, I remember going there and many visits immediately after that attack in 2006, but I didn't see much interest, or it wasn't a priority, let's say, at that particular time. Even in a place like Madu, for example, there isn't a significant amount of memorialization happening in terms of the violence that has been seen. And then, of course, we have the culture of obstructions, which is more political, particularly by the state, but also by some non-state actors. The third thing I want to highlight is some kind of different dimensions of memorialization, particularly in terms of religious places as well. One is, I think, it's a form of documentation. So there are lists of names of people who died. There are sometimes the date of birth, the date of the incident, and various factual information is there. So it has become an important form of documentation, sometimes not accessible elsewhere. Second is memorials as a site of reparations, and I think this is a well-known concept in many places. I think it serves as some form of reparations as well, one dimension of reparation. The third one is, I think, the memorials have served as a place for self-reflection for those directly involved, but also not so directly involved. For example, I have experiences when I accompanied a group of Sinhalese youth to go to Madu church, and they used to go into Madu church, but they had never talked about the violence that happened in the Madu church and the people who were killed inside the Madu church as a humanitarian space. So when they heard about that, then they got very reflective and said that, no, we never thought that this was happening in Madu church. Similarly, when some former LTT combatants came with me to Katankodi Mosque, they had very similar kind of reactions, almost disbelief, saying, no, our boys or our soldiers or our militants would not have done this, or have they done this? So it was, I think, memorials can serve as a space for self-reflection. And then education, very much linked to self-reflection. It can teach others about what happened, particularly not only the incident in the past, but also perspective and feelings, being educated about the perspective, feelings of the present day, people who are around there, who live around there, and people who are the subjects of that memorialization. The last dimension, the fifth dimension, is the memorials as a space for solidarity. And I've heard this often when I join kind of memorialization events, particularly in the North and the East, that they look, communities there like the idea of others from outside, different ethnic communities, different religious communities joining. I remember in particular a Buddhist monk coming to the memorial on one occasion in Wankale of Father Mary Bastian, who is killed in 1984, long time ago, 85, I think. And that was a very significant thing for them, because it was apparently the first time that a Sinhalese Buddhist monk attended that. So I think this dimension of solidarity is also very important when we think of memorials. So I'll stop there. Thank you again for inviting me and for organizing this.
Thank you, Ruki, for that incredibly thoughtful, I thought, highlighting of the importance of memorialization, because I think within a highly political and politicized context, one of the things that does get sidelined is the kind of spiritual purpose of memorialization, the ways in which it informs important elements of socialization, solidarity in relation to grieving that can have a restorative sort of healing effect on communities that have been traumatized. And there are a host of issues I think that came up in the discussion, but I don't want to take up too much time speaking, but I'm wondering if we can get all of the panelists on the screen so that we can get the discussion going. We already have a host of questions, but before we maybe address them, I was wondering if any of the panelists themselves had any responses or reflections to some of what was discussed, because I thought they spoke really well to each other. And I think it showed a really important continuum of the kinds of violences that are threaded together because of structural failures, because of gaps in education, because of limitations in the ways in which we address these issues within public or educational spaces. And this again is something that we at the Museum of Religious Freedom are trying to address, or trying to thoughtfully address, because they are difficult and they're not going to satisfy everyone in terms of, you know, what the correct way of, you know, representing a certain event of atrocity or violence might look like. So do any of the panelists, do you have any follow-ups or thoughts that you might add before we start taking questions?
Not right now. I think maybe as we go along, because I realize we don't have much time either, and there are so many questions.
Exactly. I mean, thank you to everyone again for those incredibly, I think, like interesting reflections as well as provocations, which will help us hopefully reevaluate how, you know, as individuals, we also think about some of these issues. And I am going to start taking questions from the Q&A, if that's okay with everyone. So we have a question about, is there a point at which memorialization could reach a logical conclusion and discontinued? How can you counter inherited hatred towards a state ethnicity vis-a-vis memorialization? I think all of the panelists can speak to this in different ways, and I think it's a good one to get us started off on. So does anyone want to take a stab at it first?
Sure. I mean, I think implied in that question is also a view perhaps, or a concern that memorialization is a negative thing, that it is something that can deepen conflict, or it is it's never ending. When is this going to stop? But now, for instance, if you go to Germany, you walk on the street, and on the paved, on the sidewalk, you have the like the tiny plaques, where they say this is where some person was taken, and that is now. So in a sense, remembering really should not become a burden, or it should not be a burden. It should, in a sense, become part of our history that we accept. It does not mean that it is something that you need to be ashamed of, right? Because I think there is that notion of shame, particularly if you are a perpetrator, or if you, and the fact is there are perpetrators in all our communities, yes. But the state bears most responsibility. But I think, so it's viewed as something related to shame. I think that's not it. It should become part of our history, something we accept, and we vow never to let take place again. And I think there was a second aspect to the question, was there? How do you counter inherited hatred toward a state? I don't think you should conflate state with ethnicity, because state is something else, right? And it's up to the government of the day to ensure that the relationship, the social contract between the citizen and the state is such that the citizen has faith. And historically, since minorities have been discriminated in Sri Lanka, I think that faith does not exist, and the relationship is broken. So it is up to the state/government to repair it. In terms of, I think, inter-community understanding, clearly there is a lot of work that has to be done at all the levels. It's state level, the community level, the individual level.
Absolutely. And I think part of this conversation is also hopefully about confronting some of that discomfort. And I was wondering if I could actually pass on to Ruki, because I think you brought up a really important point around the solidarities that can be formed around memorialization. And I think that's something that we should all be reflecting on, because it perhaps makes it easier for us to start talking about some of these things. Ruki, would you like to pitch in?
Right, I think I already mentioned about that, so I don't know what else I can add, but I saw a question in the chat box about education, so maybe I'll take the chance to talk about that in the context of solidarity as well.
Sure.
So some things that I've realized is that the teachers do have some flexibility, although it may not will be in the textbook, but there's a lot of flexibility that teachers or even principals have. And I think some teachers and principals that I have worked with, schools, have used that flexibility. And it is the same in the universities as well, much more obviously in the universities. But maybe to that comment, what I would like to add is also that it is not only, yes, certainly, anti-Tamil violence is not portrayed enough in official textbooks and official teaching of history, but it is also anti-Muslim violence is also not portrayed enough, and anti-Sinhalese violence sometimes is not portrayed enough in the Tamil medium, in Tamil schools. So many Tamil teachers and many Tamil students that I met, particularly teachers, were not very familiar with the violence that Sinhalese have been subjected to in the course of the war. So I think it's all around. It's so this is also where I think solidarity comes, that we don't only study history, or history is not learned only as a victim community, that we were the ones who suffered or suffered most, but we also try to learn about the sufferings of other communities. And out of that, I think, comes this idea of solidarity.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Suchit, would you like to comment on that? Because I think you also specifically work in relation to education. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Also thinking about what you said earlier about empathy and how we might use these spaces to cultivate empathy, but also I guess skills for engaging with historical events where there aren't perhaps, or rather there are multiple narratives, but multiple contested narratives that make it difficult for us to, I guess, position ourselves in relation to them.
Thank you, Vivian. Thank you for everyone for this conversation and kind of building on things. Yeah, I think there is, first of all, this factor of discomfort, right? So we are talking about something that puts people in discomfort. And when people feel, if that discomfort gets to a level of threat, they don't transform for me. So as an educationist, I think of always, how do we create a safe space that this conversation can take place so that the opportunity for transformation doesn't get lost? That's for me the objective of a purpose. I think when we think of memorialization, for me also, it's important that we look at the multiple aspects of that process and see the potential for transformation. So we create a dynamic process of memorialization rather than a static one.
අනුස්මරණය කියන එක ස්ථාවර දෙයක් නෙමෙයිනේ. ඒක ඉතාමත් ගතිකයි. එතකොට යම් සහකම්පනයක් නිර්මාණය කරන්න, පුද්ගලයන් තුළ සහකම්පනයක් ඇති කරන්න අපිට යම් යම් ක්‍රියාවලිය යොදා ගන්න පුළුවන්. ඒ කියන්නේ අනිත් පුද්ගලයාගේ කතාන්දරය අහන්න දකින්න සැලැස්වීම. ඒ වගේම විශ්ලේෂණය, කතාන්දර කීම පමණක් නෙමෙයි. ඒ ව්‍යුහගත ප්‍රචණ්ඩත්වය ගැන අපි කතා කරානේ. ඒතර ඒක කොහොමද විශ්ලේෂණය කරන්න යොමු වෙන්නේ? ඒ මෙන්න මේක තමයි ව්‍යුහගත ප්‍රචණ්ඩත්වය. මෙන්න මේ විදිහයි ඒක සංස්කෘතියේ ප්‍රචණ්ඩත්වයක් වෙලා අන්තිමේට ඒ ප්‍රචණ්ඩත්වයේ සාදා
process to unpack all of this as well and to reinterpret and re-envision a future where we can live together with empathy. So not just to speak to our own narratives, but to speak to the narrative of the other somehow and be in solidarity in that process. These are some reflections I'm having.
Before we move on to Shreen, Ruki, you said you wanted to add another point on solidarity.
Right. Yeah, I think sometimes solidarity is easy, for example, politically easy. For example, Buddhist monks going to the Nigambo church to express solidarity with survivors, victim families was not very difficult politically. It was still very important, still very significant, and it must continue, but that wasn't too difficult. But a Buddhist monk going to Wankale in Menna to memorialize and join a local community memorialization of a Catholic Tamil priest killed by the army was much more challenging form of solidarity. No, I think some Tamils going to the Kathankudi Mosque is a much more challenging form of solidarity. So I think we must also try to, when we talk of solidarity, go beyond the more fashionable or more conventional, more politically convenient form of solidarities and look at more difficult forms of solidarities.
I think that's such a good observation. And there are two specific questions in the Q&A, first to Shreen, and then I think Shreen and Ambika. Shreen, would you like me to read it out? Is that easiest?
I will go to the first, first question also with regard to the memorialization.
Yeah.
A9 road comes to my mind immediately after the end of the war. We had all war memorial. What does it mean to people? People who lost their kith and kin, you have the military memorial. Wherever you turn, you see bullets, armored cars, soldiers, right? I got shaken a lot, right? So what does it mean, the memory, when the memorialization is such? So that's something that we need to think about, because that will continue because it's state sponsored. Whereas we are in a country where when people come together, now say for example, Zion Church is there with the bomb mark and all, but the victims of Zion Church has created their own memorial. That is something need to continue. I feel oppressive state that we are in will never allow that kind of a memorialization, where the very victim come together, very affected people, survivors come together. This has happened even in Mana, when families of disappeared, when they started memorializing, in Kilinochi, when they started on their own, just putting rocks with the name of the disappeared, they removed it. So that is where we have to grapple with what kind of a memorialization is, whether it has to continue, in what form it has to continue. Now, say for example, the Kilinochi Memorial, in the military memorial, I don't think I can bring anybody together to that memorial, right? So this is what we have to question when it's something that might dig into the wounds of the people. How do we preserve something? And also we are constantly for the last 40 or 50 years that we can't do, I mean, we are jumping from one wound to the other wound. So there is no conducive environment for the very survived people to come and do this. And that's when the ownership comes. That's when it continues. Thank you.
Thank you, Shireen. And I think that's a really powerful evocation to talk about how we've moved on from one wound to the next. And I think that's, a really powerful statement. There is a specific question about interfaith conflict and how it affects laws, how decisions are made about us and who makes these decisions, and how can we move forward also considering the racist sentiments towards the community. That's specifically addressed to you. Along with a couple of other follow-up questions on the reforms to the MMDA to both Shreen and Ambika. And I'm wondering whether you two would like to speak on that a little bit.
Ambika, do you want to go?
Yep, sure. Quite happy to. So I think the question was, do any of the panelists think that the MMDA reforms that are being proposed is an extension of anti-Muslim hate agenda? Well, I would say that, the reforms that are being proposed are coming from the women within the community. The reforms that are being proposed are coming from women who are affected, who have been affected by the law, by the existing laws and existing practices. So I think it is disingenuous and does a lot of disservice to the women to portray it as something that is anti-Muslim and an extension of it. That in a way I think is appropriating, it's a very, what shall we say, strategically it's appropriating the bigotry of the state as an excuse to deny the demands of women. So I don't think it is that at all. And if at all, I think it's a way of silencing the voices of the women. And do you think that the proposed transfer of jurisdiction in the caste system, the district court, is an attack on the heritage of the Muslims in Sri Lanka? Well, I would say personally, I would say no. And my position also comes from speaking extensively with Muslim women who have been working on the issue. I would say that it is not an attack on the Muslims, because what it is aiming to do is to make the process fairer, to make it more transparent, to prevent arbitrary decision making, to ensure that women are not adversely affected, to give voice to women, to give women rights. So in a sense, when the women of the community are being empowered, I don't think it's accurate to say that the community is being attacked.
Ruki, did you have a comment on this?
Yes, and I totally identify with what Ambika said, and I think there are plenty of attacks and hostility against Muslims, but the MMDA reform is not one of them. In fact, I see it as quite the opposite. No, MMDA reform is something to reduce the oppression of Muslim women and Muslim children, and so it's part of a kind of a progressive process that needs to go forward. To call it or to label it as hostility against the Muslim community, I think is really, really dangerous, and I hope we can put it to rest very soon.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that we're running out of time, but there's a question which I think is quite good and maybe we should address from Suren. How do we encourage at the educational level memorialization relevant to generations of Sri Lankans? And I think that's a good one, because I think there is a focus on youth where non-recurrence is concerned, but how do we also address multiple segments of the community? How do we address the older? How do we address parents, grandparents, children, young people? Suchit, I feel like maybe this is one for you to start with.
Yeah, I think it's important that we make it a part of our cultural setup somehow. We find cultural practices that make these conversations happen. So how do we bring this difficult conversation somehow to a dinner table conversation where generations, you go and talk to the grandparent and find out what was happening, and then maybe the younger person asks questions in a different way because their experience of living is very different. So I think we need to explore more. As educationists, I always think of models of learning, models of dialogue, models of interaction that we can support the communities with. So yeah, one example is maybe to invite few of your friends over for a dinner, and if those friends are from different communities, over the dinner have this conversation about something that's very uncomfortable. It's not a typical dinner conversation, but I think if we really want to confront the history and talk about this and really meaningfully, we need to make this part of our cultural. The food has to come in, the visits to the religious places has to come in, the Sunday sermons, the Jummah sermons, all of these have to talk about it. It can't happen just with the civil society championing this as a cause. It has to become part of the mainstream conversations in the country, over dinner tables, in the Sunday, in the prayer speeches, everywhere. This is how I envision us looking at more openly and in solidarity these topics.
Would any of the other, I'm mindful of the time as well, so perhaps we can also consider these a set of concluding remarks. So I'd like all of the panelists to perhaps pitch in a little bit and maybe give us your concluding remarks, if that's okay. I appreciate that there are loads of questions that we might haven't really had the time to address, but I'm also hoping that we as a museum team will figure out a way to maybe continue to have these conversations and address these questions in other initiatives. But we thank everyone for taking the time to type out your questions and also attend and participate. So Shreen, would you like to sort of offer a set of concluding remarks?
See, it's coming from the German. Some of us visited Germany to understand how they are retelling the history. It's very interesting. Very old people coming to common places where they will sit, and the children will go on a tour, seeing some of the memorial, which is very peaceful, not like they don't show the gas chamber of Hitler, but then it's how many people died. Each of them are represented by various things and pillars and all. They sit and they tell what happened to them. Until we get the survivors to talk, until we get the families to tell their stories from every side, we will not heal through. And that has to come through our education system also. We don't have to stick to our books to tell our stories, our painful memories. Our children need to learn from older generation. And that's, now this is a month of eviction of Northern Muslims. I would like to even Zoom, from Zoom call, going to school students and tell them what happened to me and how I adored my Tamil sisters and brothers still, but this happened to us, right? So there should be some way of telling this for healing purposes, not to provoke any form of animosity, but to heal through that process. And the younger people have to understand that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Ambika, are you on?
Yes, I'm here. No, I just switched my video off because the connection is a bit unstable. I think just to go back to what Ruki said about solidarity, I think the distinction to make is solidarity versus being allies, because what Ruki described should happen is what allyship is, in that you don't appropriate space or voice, but you stand with them and you help amplify their voice. We also have in Sri Lanka monuments, not memorials. There is a difference, and we need to recognize that, memorials versus monuments. And it all comes down to whose life is grievable. Some lives are not worth grieving, is what the state is telling us. So this brings us to, empathy. How do you create empathy? But at the end of the day, you can't get beyond the fact that it's this, a lot of responsibility rests with the state. To come back to what Shreen said about, we need every survivor to be able to tell their stories, but in order for them to do that, we need a conducive environment, which comes back to having a state that does not have a singular Buddhist majoritarian agenda and treats its minorities as second-class citizens.
I think that's extremely important. I think particularly the framing of it, because I think some of this is also contingent on the language we use, right? And again, this question of space and who speaks and, how we kind of create spaces and enable people to speak. So just to kind of wrap up, Ruki, is there anything that you would like to add to this?
Right. So I want to focus more on education. No? So I think there's a memorialization can be serving as a form of education in different spaces. One is in the formal system, but I think the actual physical sites are also very important because the physical sites don't only relate to facts about something that happened, but also it can capture the feelings and the aspirations of different communities who still live around there or those affected. So I think that is important, and I think this effort of a museum is very important. I've been very struck by visiting for example, the Apartheid Museum in South Africa, the Free Dairy Museum in Northern Ireland, so even in Cambodia. So I think hopefully we don't have any such in Sri Lanka. So although this is a virtual museum to start with, I hope that we can move towards in that direction of at least having a museum as well. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you, everyone, and very grateful to the panelists' reflection on this very sort of complicated, I'm going to say, subject matter that we could have, many number of conversations on. But also thank you to everyone who attended. Before we wrap up, I'm going to hand over again to Shalomi, who will again offer us a brief glimpse into the museum space for those of you who missed it at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, India, and also thank you to all our panelists and to those who joined as well. As we reach the end of our webinar, I would like to also thank a few people who have been very supportive of this work. So firstly, a special thank you to Godfrey Yogaraja, our CEO, who has offered unstinted support, Yamini Ravindran, Campaigns Director for Minor Matters, Mike Gabriel, the project lead, and the Minor Matters team, comprising Akshana Paliyavadana, Shanal Jesudian, Navindu Mendes, Richel Marcelin, and so many others as well. We would also like to thank our panel of experts who have helped us throughout the process of developing the museum, who took time to go through the material and make some very valuable suggestions. Let me also thank UNDP, the European Union, and CKU in Denmark for their support. And like I mentioned earlier, this webinar is organized as a series of events throughout the month of October. So next week, we will be talking about how we can legislate on religion or legislate religion. So do stay tuned for more information on this, and do join us next week for our fourth and final webinar on this series based on the Museum of Religious Freedom. So thank you for joining, and we will be playing a short video on the museum as we wrap up. And from all of us at Minor Matters, good night and see you soon.
Thank you. Good night. Bye.
Thank you,
Thank
Shalomi.
you.
The Museum of Religious Freedom was imagined as an inclusive virtual space for archiving, learning, and critically reflecting on the complex histories and contemporary concerns relating to the freedom of religion or belief in Sri Lanka.
Thematic areas within the museum have been informed by the mapping of 70 events and incidents related to religious freedom, and is a place for exploratory learning spanning from the colonial period to the present day.
We invite you to discover the virtual spaces made up of digitized artifacts and architectural elements, archival documents, audio-visual content, community conversations, and expert commentary focused on issues related to the freedom of religion or belief in Sri Lanka. Join us.